I want you to prepare to do the heavy lifting. You need to be communicating with your senator or senators every step of the way about how you feel about how the confirmation process is going and how it should operate. First up is the big news about the Supreme Court vacancy that has arisen as a result of Justice Stephen Breyer retiring. It surprised everyone, at least it surprised me. And the left has been pressuring him to go. And it looks like that pressure worked. It was unprecedented. You know, I've been in Washington longer than I care to admit to. I've never seen anything like it. You may have missed it if you're a normal person who doesn't follow the leftist narratives like people like me follow. But the left has been pressuring him to retire, too old, and he's got to retire. They didn't want him to die in office at the wrong time and not allow, and I would presume, a radical leftist to replace him. And how do I suspect it was like almost a forced retirement? Because it became pretty clear in interviews, at least one or two interviews that I saw, that Stephen Breyer had zero interest in retiring. Yet he did it, and it was obvious he did it. And he may have done it on his own, but there was, as I said, this significant pressure that raised the question about the push to have him retire and whether it was a voluntary retirement or one that was, just too much for him to bear in terms of pressure, and so he ended up leaving. Either way, it means that Joe Biden gets to, in theory, make his first appointment to the Supreme Court. But of course, the left is rising. The extremist left is rising in the Democratic Party. And Joe Biden has promised, and he reiterated that promise, that he was going to only pick a Black woman. So here you have the President of the United States promising to engage in racial and sex discrimination in figuring out who to select to be his first Supreme Court nominee. I've never seen anything like it. Now, the left likes to say, oh, look at Ronald Reagan. He said he wanted to appoint a woman. Well, it's a big difference between saying, I'd like to appoint a Black woman. I'd like to appoint this ethnic group, or I'd like to appoint that gender, which I think, by the way, is ridiculous anyway, either way. And I was 12 years old when Reagan was in office, so no one asked me what I thought about him desiring to appoint a woman. My view is the key metric ought to be whether someone is capable as a judge and whether they will follow the rules that we expect them to follow under our constitutional system, which is A, respect for the Constitution, a willingness to apply the Constitution as written and originally understood, and not to substitute your own personal judgment for what the law is. Now, that gives you a lot of leeway, at least if you're someone who's principled. But we all know what the folks around Joe Biden want. So the same extremist left that browbeat a Supreme Court justice, you can bet is going to demand that President Biden appoint a radical. Now, I don't know enough about the number of Black women who Joe Biden would be considering to know, well, maybe they can't find a radical among them. But they can find a liberal, and they can find a liberal who is unlikely to be the type of judge who won't politicize the court, who will respect the Constitution. So in my view, every senator should oppose that, if that's the case, as I believe it's likely to be the case. In addition, you have as I call it, the CRT approach to selecting a Supreme Court justice. So the President of the United States is telling men and or white people or any other race they can't apply. For instance, there's a major figure on the I shouldn't say the Supreme Court because it isn't. It's the Court of Appeals here in the District of Columbia. And he's youngish. I think he's chief judge. So he's the chief judge of the second most important court in the land. because typically the appellate court here in D.C. is seen as a stepping stone to the Supreme Court, and because it's in Washington D.C., they handle a lot of important cases as it relates to government, and that's where we do most of our business here in Washington D.C. So we've been before that appellate court more often than I'd like, given the way some of the judges have been ruling. Well, anyway, this judge, Sri Siravanishanan, I'm sure I'm mangling his name. Well, according to Biden, he's eminently qualified. I mean, in terms of judicial philosophy, I would reject him, but he's eminently qualified. And I'm sure there are other judges like him who are eminently qualified, who the president is going to bar the door to the White House from being considered. And as I suggested earlier, you can signal that you're interested in, quote, diversity. There are all sorts of code words you can use. And like I said, I find it objectionable that we do this racial and sex bean counting and this sort of quota system that, needs to be filled when appointing judges. But, sometimes it's just politics. Maybe there is a political component to it. So I may not like it, but it may not be the end of the world. But what is really problematic and really undermines the Supreme Court and the notion of the rule of law is President Biden being obsessed with it and promising and confirming discrimination. Now, in the case of Ronald Reagan, as Professor Jonathan Turley has noted, he said he wanted to appoint a woman, but they considered other choices. So if Biden had said, look, boy, I'd like to make history and appoint a Black woman, but, I'm going to consider, there's all sorts of applicants I'm going to consider, but we'll see what happens. That's within the realm of reason. At least what passes for reason here in Washington, D.C. But instead, you have this racialism that is objectionable. And in my view, it's pernicious. And the Senate should be, if he does act and confirm, and the process turns out that he only considered people based on race and sex, the Senate should say no. The Senate should say no. And generally speaking, the Senate should refuse to move forward a nominee who isn't committed to the Constitution as written and who won't promise not to legislate from the bench. We don't need any more judicial activism. I mean, the Supreme Court, the left on the Supreme Court has politicized it terribly. Even some of the Republican appointees, like Chief Justice Roberts, who's very nervous about the Supreme Court being politicized, makes political decisions because he's nervous about it. So it isn't just a Democrat thing. It can be a Republican thing as well. One thing, there was a story recently, I shouldn't say recently, I just read it a few hours before I came on. I think it was in Vox magazine, VOX. And the writer went back and looked at the history of how Breyer got onto the court. And Breyer got onto the court because he was a lawyer who was well known in the Senate because he had worked in the Senate. So the Republicans who were in influential positions in the Senate knew him and were friendly with him. They worked together. And so Orrin Hatch, who was head of the Judiciary Committee for the Republicans, he called Bill Clinton up and said, look, you should nominate, according to this story, Justice Breyer or Justice Ginsburg. And, those both of them eventually were nominated and confirmed with many, many Republican support votes. And it highlights how true that truism is, or I've found to be a truism, that federal judges are often lawyers who know senators. The old saw is judges are lawyers who know politicians. When you're at the federal level, federal judges are lawyers who know senators, and Breyer is a perfect example of that. Now, I reject that approach to judicial selection, especially since our Constitution is under assault as a result of appointees that come from that insider background. And we need more justices in the mold of Alito and Thomas, and less justices in the mode of Breyer and, frankly, Chief Justice Roberts, who was also kind of an insider for in terms of DC. So we'll see what happens. And this is what I ask you to do. I want you to prepare to do the heavy lifting. You need to be communicating with your senator or senators every step of the way about how you feel about how the confirmation process is going and how it should operate. Now, there are more than a few Republicans who would like you to believe that, well, the Senate, there's nothing they can do to stop a Supreme Court justice nominated by Biden from being confirmed by the Senate. Well, that's not true. It's simply not true. And I'll explain the rules to you generally. The Senate isn't 60-40 Democrat Republican. It's not even 52-48 Democrat Republican. It's 50-50. So as a result, the committees are split evenly. 11-11, I think it is, in the Senate Judiciary Committee. Now, typically for a nomination to move to the floor, the majority of those present must vote on it. And so if there's a tie vote, the nomination can't move to the floor. And just so you know, if the nomination can't move to the floor, there's really no way for them to consider it without, and I'm just kind of boiling it down, without a 67 vote margin. They need 67 votes to move the nomination forward. Now, technically, they could overcome that rule through, using the nuclear option, the version of the option they wanted to use to shut the filibuster down, but that's unlikely to succeed. So my point is, if all Republicans on the Senate Judiciary Committee, which is currently led by Lindsey Graham, at least on the Republican side, refuse to let the nominee go forward, the nominee could be stopped. And as I said, there are many Republicans who probably don't want you to understand that or know that, but you need to hold them accountable. Now, Lindsey Graham has been notorious for voting for most of President Biden's judicial nominees. Did you know he's, I think, only opposed one or two, if that? Certainly on committee, I'm not aware of him opposing. I think he's only opposed one on committee. Dozens of other judges, just he's voted through. Now, so Lindsey Graham is head of the Judiciary Committee, so it's worth talking to his office, whether or not you live in South Carolina. It's worth talking, obviously, to your members if they're on the Judiciary Committee, but you should let all your members know. And if your members are Democrats, if your senators are Democrats, don't feel shy about communicating with them. Look, they modulate their positions based on what they're hearing from their constituents. And don't you think that just because they may say something publicly, they're not saying something privately because they're getting flack from home. So the way it works is I stand with Chuck Schumer when they're on the floor, but when they're off the floor, they're saying, Chuck, what are you doing to me? Why are we proceeding this way? Is there a way we can get out of this? Let's shut this down. So that's the value of communicating with your elected representatives, no matter who they are, Democrat or Republican. And plus, it's a good civic thing to do. You can't complain. I guess you can complain about Washington. But I think it's important and useful to communicate with your elected representatives. I think it's just good citizenship. And you may think it's not fruitful. I'm telling you it is. I've been doing this long enough to know that calls matter on the Hill. They matter so much that even if they're not being picked up, they know what's happening because they kind of have a feel for the volume of calls, even if they're not getting them to all of them. So you've got to participate often in this process in communicating with your senators. So you've got to do the heavy lifting. And you should know that it's not a sure thing that whoever is nominated by Biden gets confirmed. I can't imagine, for instance, just politically speaking, why Republicans would move forward any nominee before the November elections. But I guess that's a political position, isn't it? So I'm concerned as head of Judicial Watch about ensuring that nominees are constitutionalists, won't legislate from the bench, aren't politicians in robes. And I'm also concerned about the Senate not participating in a discriminatory process that has explicitly frozen out citizens of the United States of America from being considered based on their race and sex. Those are pretty simple principles. And I think I understand that people have different judicial philosophies about how judges should decide. But aren't we all supposed to agree that you can't discriminate on the basis of sex and race? No, we aren't, because the left doesn't actually believe that. And that's being exposed here in this big fight. Now, what I think the Republicans ought not to do is they shouldn't do what the left did to people like Justice Kavanaugh, who was targeted with violence. They were trying to overthrow the Senate with violence and intimidation and harassment. They smeared him, they defamed him, they abused the powers of the Senate to target him and investigate him. They broke the rules of the Senate. They misused the FBI, in my view, to investigate him for no good reason, all to try to derail him. And frankly, I think we're still facing some of the negative rulings, at least from my perspective, that he's been on the wrong side of. More recently, supporting a mandate for poor healthcare workers to be forced to take an irreversible medical procedure, i.e. vaccinations for COVID. I think, that shook him. And he's been, seemingly trying to rehabilitate himself with the people who tried to destroy him. I don't understand it. Well, either way, but that's not the way we should go. We should be principled in opposition, respectful of the rule of law. We shouldn't try to overthrow the Senate the way the left did. But we should say no to race discrimination, no to sex discrimination, no to CRT guiding the confirmation process, and no to politicized judicial decision-making, which steals liberty, steals your right to self-govern. Because when judges act as politicians, they're stealing your God-given right to govern yourself through your elected representatives under our constitutional system. So none of this, we're going to give the president deserves a Supreme Court nominee because just because he's the president. No, the senators have an independent obligation, in my view, to protect the Constitution from the predations of the judicial activists that would undermine it. So there you go. I talked a little bit more about this. By the way, if you haven't seen it, I encourage you to go watch it. I was on this podcast YouTube show with Tim Pool. It's called Timcast, and it was a more casual setting. And we talked for 2 hours about all sorts of things. And I encourage you to go watch it on our channel or on his channel, Timcast, on YouTube. And I talked about this, and I was glad to be able to do it there because, like I said, it's important we remind people, and that's a different audience than the audience that probably watches me and Judicial Watch here. It's probably younger and, not as conservative as the typical, as the audience on this channel or this platform that watches Judicial Watch and supports Judicial Watch. But we have to remind people, yes, communicate with your senators. This is how judges should rule. It's not appropriate for presidents to pick judges based on race and sex. Those basic principles we should just be constantly repeating and reiterating over the next few months because our Constitution, as always, is at stake.
Thanks for tuning in. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel to catch all the latest news from Judicial Watch.